I always knew money was tight. It wasn't something we talked about openly, but it lingered in every decision my family made. Whether it was the way my mom hesitated before handing over a credit card at the grocery store or how my dad would remind us to turn off the lights to save electricity, the signs were always there. We weren't destitute, but every dollar mattered. Every expense was weighed carefully, and luxuries, well, they were out of the question. Christmas was no exception. For most families, it's a season of joy and giving, but for us, it often came with a heavy dose of anxiety. My parents did their best to make it magical, but when you're living paycheck to paycheck, magic has its limits. I remember one year vividly. My cousins tore into their shiny new presents, unwrapping the latest gadgets and expensive toys. My gift? A second-hand puzzle with a missing piece. I forced a smile, but inside, I felt the sting of embarrassment. Even as a child, I understood that I didn't have what others had. It wasn't about the material things, though. It was the feeling of being different, of not belonging. I started finding ways to contribute, thinking it might make up for what we lacked financially. I'd help with decorating the tree, baking cookies, and even crafting handmade gifts, little tokens of effort and love. But no matter what I did, it felt like my contributions were overshadowed by the glitz and glamour of what others could buy. As I grew older, the weight of those expectations became heavier. By the time I reached adulthood, I was juggling part-time jobs and trying to build a life of my own, but financial freedom still felt out of reach. My family, on the other hand, seemed to have moved on to a different world, a world where lavish celebrations and expensive gifts were the norm. I felt like I was standing on the outside, peering in through frosted windows at a life I couldn't access. "Why don't you just work harder?" my mom would say during those rare heart-to-hearts about money. Her words were meant to encourage me, but they only deepened my feelings of inadequacy. I was working hard, harder than most people I knew, but it was never enough. The pressure to keep up reached its peak every Christmas. My mom, ever the perfectionist, would stress about every detail, the dinner menu, the decorations, and, most importantly, the gifts. Christmas is about giving, she'd remind us, but I knew what she really meant. Christmas is about showing up. About proving that you belong. The year it all fell apart was no different. By December, I was already stretched thin, trying to pay bills and make ends meet. The idea of buying gifts felt impossible. "What are you getting everyone this year?" my mom asked casually over the phone. I hesitated. "I'm not sure yet," I admitted. "Well, you'd better figure it out." "Everyone's expecting something," she said sharply. There it was again, that underlying expectation that I couldn't meet. I spent days agonizing over what to do. Should I skip a few meals to save money? Put something on a credit card I couldn't afford to pay off? The stress consumed me, and as the days ticked by, I realized I didn't have an answer. When Christmas Eve arrived, I walked into my parents' house carrying nothing but a bottle of wine, a last-minute purchase to avoid showing up empty-handed. The air inside was warm, filled with the smell of roasted turkey and pine. My cousins were gathered around the tree, exchanging stories about their recent vacations and expensive gadgets. I felt like I didn't belong, but I kept telling myself to get through the evening. My mom, ever the orchestrator of our family gatherings, was bustling around the kitchen. "Did you bring the gifts?" she whispered when I walked in. I couldn't. I didn't, I stammered, my voice barely audible. Her face froze, and for a moment, I thought she might understand. But then her lips tightened. "You couldn't even try?" she asked, her voice filled with disappointment. The dinner table was set beautifully, crystal glasses, silverware that gleamed under the chandelier's light. But as we sat down, I couldn't shake the knot in my stomach. My mom started her usual routine, asking everyone to share what gifts they had brought for each other. When it was my turn, I felt every pair of eyes on me. I couldn't afford anything this year, I said quietly. The room fell silent, and I wished I could disappear. You're just not trying hard enough, my mom said, breaking the silence. Her words hit me like a slap. Around the table, my cousins exchanged glances, and I could feel their judgment without them saying a word. In that moment, the gap between us felt like a canyon. No amount of effort, love, or creativity could bridge it. Christmas has always been a complicated season in my family, a blend of chaos, celebration, and unspoken tension. On the surface, it seemed like a joyful time, filled with twinkling lights, piles of presents, and the scent of my mom's famous holiday roast wafting through the house. But beneath the glitter and glow, there were cracks that widened with each passing year. Every December, the cycle would begin, the frantic shopping, the whispered phone calls about who was buying what, and my mom's endless quest to make the holiday perfect. She'd spend hours decorating the tree, carefully arranging ornaments that had been passed down for generations. This one was your grandmother's, she'd say, holding up a delicate glass bauble. It should have been a moment of connection, but instead, it felt like a reminder of the weight of traditions I couldn't keep up with. And then there were the gatherings. My family is big, loud, and, let's just say, opinionated. Every year, the house would fill with the sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and the occasional heated debate over politics or sports. It should have felt like a warm embrace, a celebration of togetherness. But for me, it was something else entirely. Christmas in my family wasn't just a holiday, it was a performance. Everyone had their roles, the generous givers, the gracious receivers, the proud parents showing off their children's accomplishments. And then there was me, fumbling to play a part one didn't know how to embody. How could I compete with my cousins, who arrived each year with stories of exotic vacations and high-powered jobs? Their gifts were always extravagant, designer handbags, the latest tech gadgets, even plane tickets. Meanwhile, I was lucky if I could scrape together enough for a thoughtful card or a homemade present. The lead up to that particular Christmas dinner was no different, except this time, the stakes felt higher. My mom had been dropping hints for weeks. Everyone's going all out this year, she said one evening as we chatted on the phone. I heard your cousin Sarah is giving her parents a weekend getaway. That's great, I replied, forcing enthusiasm into my voice. But inside, panic was setting in. I couldn't even afford to treat myself to a coffee some days, let alone fund a luxurious gift. I thought about skipping the dinner altogether. Would anyone even notice if I wasn't there? But the idea of not showing up felt like admitting defeat. Besides, my mom had made it clear, attendance wasn't optional. The days leading up to Christmas were a blur of anxiety. I wandered through crowded stores, staring at price tags that made my heart sink. What could I possibly give that wouldn't look cheap or thoughtless? I tried to remind myself that Christmas wasn't about material things, but in my family, appearances mattered. By Christmas Eve, I was out of time and out of options. I showed up at my parents' house empty-handed, clutching a bottle of wine I'd grabbed from the discount rack at the grocery store. The house was already buzzing with activity, kids running around in matching pajamas, the hum of a Christmas playlist in the background, and my mom flitting from room to room, making sure everything was just right. "Did you bring the gifts?" she asked as I stepped through the door. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. "I couldn't this year," I said finally. Her smile faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough to send a wave of guilt crashing over me. "Well, we'll talk later," she said, her voice tight. Dinner that night was as elaborate as ever. The table was set with fine china, the centerpiece was a work of art, and the food looked like something out of a magazine. but I couldn't enjoy any of it. The tension in the air was palpable, at least to me. As the meal progressed, my mind raced. What would happen when the topic of gifts inevitably came up? Could I deflect? Change the subject? My family has a way of zeroing in on weakness, and I felt like a gazelle in a room full of lions. When the moment arrived, my mom going around the table, asking each person to share what they had given, I felt a lump rise in my throat. One by one, my cousins proudly detailed their contributions. I got my parents a new espresso machine. I gave my sister concert tickets. The room buzzed with approval, the kind of validation I knew I wouldn't receive. And then it was my turn. All eyes were on me, the anticipation thick enough to cut with a knife. I couldn't afford anything this year, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, no one said anything, but their expressions spoke volumes. My mom broke the silence with a sigh. You could have at least tried, she said, her tone dripping with disappointment. Tears pricked my eyes, but I swallowed them back. I wanted to scream, to explain how hard I'd been working, how much I was struggling. But what was the point? They wouldn't understand. As I sat there, feeling the weight of their judgment, I realized something. This wasn't about the gifts. It was about the unspoken rules of our family, the expectation that success equaled worth, that material things define love. And in that moment, I felt like I'd failed on both counts. The moment came like a storm I could neither avoid nor prepare for. We were all seated around the dining table, the glow of candles casting a warm light over the scene. Plates piled high with roasted turkey, mashed potatoes, and cranberry sauce sat untouched as the real event of the evening began. My mom cleared her throat, a signal everyone in the family recognized. It was time for the gift discussion. So, she said, her voice carrying the tone of a conductor beginning a symphony. Let's go around and share what we got for each other this year. My stomach tightened. I knew this moment was coming, yet it still hit like a punch to the gut. I'd hoped, prayed even, that it might be skipped, that this year would be different. But of course, tradition reigned supreme in our family, and this ritual was sacred. One by one, my relatives chimed in, their voices filled with pride and satisfaction. I got Mom and Dad a new espresso machine, Sarah announced, earning approving nods. And I got my little brother a pair of AirPods. That's so thoughtful, my mom said, beaming at Sarah as if she'd single-handedly saved Christmas. My cousin Matt was next. I chipped in for those concert tickets for Aunt Claire and Uncle Jim, he said, leaning back in his chair with a self-satisfied grin. That's going to be an amazing experience for them, someone exclaimed, and the room hummed with excitement. The spotlight moved from one family member to another, each story of generosity adding to the weight pressing down on me. My palms were clammy, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. Finally, it was my turn. My mom's eyes met mine, her expression expectant but laced with something else, doubt. Disappointment? I cleared my throat, my voice catching before I even began. I hesitated, my mind racing for a way out. But there was none. I couldn't afford gifts this year. The room fell into a silence so profound, it felt like all the air had been sucked out. My words hung there, exposed, vulnerable, as though they were a confession rather than a simple truth. You what? My mom said, breaking the silence, her tone sharp and incredulous. I didn't have the money, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. Didn't have the money, she repeated, her voice rising with each word. We all have responsibilities, you know. Everyone has their struggles, but we still make an effort. Couldn't you have done something? Even a small gesture? I tried, Mom, I said, my voice trembling. I really did, but things have been so tight lately. I just couldn't make it work. Oh, please, Sarah muttered under her breath, just loud enough for me to hear. It's not that hard to plan ahead. That was the breaking point. A lump formed in my throat, but I refused to cry, not here, not in front of them. You don't understand, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. I've been working so hard just to make ends meet. Do you have any idea what that's like? To choose between groceries and rent? Don't raise your voice, my mom snapped, her face flushed with a mix of embarrassment and anger. This isn't about your struggles. It's about the family. About being part of something bigger than yourself. Exactly, I said, unable to hold back now. And maybe being part of something bigger means not measuring everyone by how much they can spend on Christmas. The room was buzzing with unspoken tension. My cousins exchanged glances, whispering behind their hands. My mom looked at me like I'd just broken an unbreakable rule. You need to leave, she said suddenly, her voice cold and final. What? I asked, stunned. You're ruining Christmas for everyone, she said. If you can't contribute, then maybe you shouldn't be here. Her words hit me like a slap. I stood there for a moment, frozen, as the weight of her statement sank in. My mind raced, should I fight back? Apologize? But then I realized, this wasn't a battle I could win. Fine, I said, my voice cracking. If that's what you want, I'll go. I pushed my chair back, the sound scraping against the floor like a scream. The room was silent again, all eyes on me as I walked toward the door. No one stopped me. No one said a word. As I stepped outside into the biting cold, the weight of what had just happened finally hit me. Tears streamed down my face, hot against the chill of the night air. I felt a mix of emotions, anger, humiliation, sadness, but most of all, a deep sense of rejection. I stood there for a moment, looking back at the house, the windows glowing with warmth and light. Inside, they were probably laughing again, moving on like nothing had happened. And I was out here, alone, cast out like I didn't belong. But as I walked away, something else began to stir inside me, a quiet, stubborn resolve. If this was how my family measured worth, then maybe I didn't want to meet their standards. Maybe it was time to define my own. As I walked away that night, the sting of rejection cut deep, but it also sparked a realization: family isn't defined by gifts or expectations, it's about love, acceptance, and understanding. How often do we let material things cloud what truly matters? This experience, though painful, taught me to value the connections built on compassion rather than comparison. It made me ask myself, do I need their approval to find my own worth? Maybe being cast out was a blessing, a chance to redefine what family means on my own terms. What would you do if faced with the same choice?